Hello, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and I'm very thankful for being able to cooperate with Anna Wieslander and the Atlantic Council again. We decided to go on using web discussions regarding European leadership and Corona crisis until we can meet again in person. So Germany will take over the EU presidency from July onwards, and it was decided to focus on a large extent on the relations with China and the country's geopolitical role. China is, by statement of the EU from March 2019, officially treated both as a strategic partner and a systemic rival for Europe. That means that it is very clear that a consistent European approach towards China, as well as towards Russia, still has to be found. Chancellor Merkel recently said that Europeans have to be aware of how determined China is to take up a leading place in the global world. In addition to that, it is also very important that Europe determines its position between China and the US. At the same time, the rapidly rising influence of China and the relative decline of the US puts into question established practices that states have based their foreign policy on. China has to be in our focus when it comes to its effect on international order and creating dependency in Europe. However, we should not forget about Russia and its will to further destabilize liberal democracies in Europe. My personal experience is very much linked to the last 7 years I spent in Ukraine for the foundation before I came to Stockholm. Dialogue was even then possible, but with very limited influence on those who make decisions in Russia. So now I'm looking forward to our discussion with 4 outstanding guests from Germany, Great Britain, and the US. As always, I would like to encourage you to use the Q&A button to ask questions or give comments to our speakers. But now, as we have limited time, Anna, the floor is yours, please. You have to switch on your microphone, Anna.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Gabrielle, for this kind introduction. And I would like to welcome you to this webinar, where we'll look into the geopolitical effects on Northern Europe of the Corona crisis and implications for European leadership. So we have a great audience, both from Europe and the United States. Good morning to my colleagues in the United States. And we have until 16 hours Central Eastern Time for this seminar. We are on the record, I would like to say, again, so we are on social media. For the record, Michta will be expressing his personal views and not that of the George C. Marshall Center. Now, the Atlantic Council Office, which I'm heading here in Stockholm, we have discussed now for a few years how to secure Northern Europe, which has become a high tension area in the very front lines of some of the most important geopolitical developments in the world. And to grasp the approach of looking at how to combine the Baltic Sea with the Arctic, the North Atlantic, and doing that from 3 perspectives. First, an assertive Russia, who has used military force, as we all know, in Georgia, Ukraine, modernizing its armed forces, but also constantly using information and cyber operations towards Western democracies to cohesion and weaken our relationship through increased deterrence and defense. There are also calls for renewed cooperation and increased dialogue, and I think we would like to discuss that a bit more. Secondly, the transatlantic relationship, which is crucial for security in Northern Europe. The US has strengthened its military presence here in the past years, but the unpredictability of the Trump administration casts a shadow on that commitment, most lately with the troops withdrawal announced for Germany. While also US gets into a growing competition with China. China is also more present in the region, notably in the Arctic, but also in infrastructure investments around the Baltic Sea, where it has conducted with Russia. And then third, the European Union. So the EU has deepened its defense cooperation and is set to become a geopolitical actor. How can that benefit the security situation of Northern Europe? Not least, the EU can play a role in hybrid warfare and in collaboration between the EU and NATO in order to strengthen the European pillar of NATO. Now, the crisis has accelerated some of these trends that highly affect the security in Northern Europe. Increased tensions among major actors. How does that play out in Northern Europe? What are the challenges, but also what are the opportunities? So I'm delighted to welcome today and introduce an excellent set of speakers with us. And I would like to start with Edward Lucas, who is a senior fellow at CEPA and who has for many years, formerly as a journalist at The Economist, writer, analyzed the security situation in the Baltic Sea region with an eye on Russia, and I believe increasingly you also have an eye on China. You're an expert on hybrid warfare. So, Edward, how does the growing geopolitical tensions affect the security in Northern Europe, in your view?
Well, hello, and thank you, Anna, and to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for hosting this, and greetings to my fellow panelists. I think that the first thing to say about Northern Europe is that this is a region where you have everything you need to cook in the kitchen already. You have a nuclear power in the form of Britain. You have two big countries, Britain and Poland. You have highly advanced economies, Britain, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark. You have countries with deep experience in dealing with hybrid warfare in the form of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. You have countries that are very close to the United States, countries that are a bit less close to the United States, but still pretty close. You have countries that are in the EU and have deep influence in EU decision-making. You have countries that are not in the EU, but are in NATO. You have countries that are in both. You don't have any countries that are in neither. It's worth just looking at the figures. The combined GDP of the Nordic 5, Baltic 3 and Poland is the same size as Russia. And the combined defense spending of those 9 countries is about half Russia's. But Russia, with its defense spending, has to run satellite program, nuclear program, deal with China, run a blue water navy and so on. And the Nordic, Baltic, Polish 9, with their defense budget, really have to defend themselves. Add in Britain and the United States in whatever shape or form that involvement will be in the future. And as I say, everything you need to cook, you have in the kitchen. You may have to do things differently. We may have to spend more on defense or spend what we do spend on defense differently and more efficiently, but it's there. We don't need to say, as you might say in the Black Sea region or in the Sahel, this is only going to work with a lot of help from the outside world. Help from the outside world is nice. There may be some things where it'll be super useful, but basically we can do what we want. The second point I want to make is that for the last 20, 30 years, depending on where you sit, the big story has been a growing worry about Russia. That was always the case in the Baltic states, where even in the early 90s, you were trying to get rid of the remaining occupation troops. And Poland always had a pretty clear threat perception. Finland did, although they didn't talk about it. But other countries perhaps less so, and there's been a dawning realization, or to use the cliche wake-up call, which is now rippled pretty much all the way across the region. You may have some people in Denmark perhaps less keen on territorial defense than maybe Finns. Iceland still a little bit out in some cases, but these are nuances. There's basically a shared threat perception on Russia, and I would say a pretty accurate one. People realize that there is a potential one. This is something we need to worry about next day. It's not like in Ukraine. There is a worry about energy, and Nord Stream 2 obviously very much in focus. And there's worry about subversion, the sort of different forms of so-called hybrid warfare. But I feel that that is in a kind of equilibrium. It's not, perhaps not a static equilibrium, but dynamic equilibrium, that as Russia does stupid things, we respond. We've beefed up the contingency plans, first of all, for the reinforcement, now moving towards the defence of the Baltic states, conscription being reintroduced, pretty thorough work being done in Finland and Sweden in particular. If you haven't seen it already, I strongly recommend the Finnish video that came out last week called Battlescape. I won't attempt to pronounce it in Finnish, but it's a sort of hypothetical hybrid warfare attack on Finland, including kinetic element, and it shows how the Finnish military would deal with that. So that's all kind of more or less, it's either okay or being fixed. What I think is a much sharper threat is China. So here's a question: where are in Northern Europe the political prisoners held abroad? We don't have any Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Finns, Poles, Swedes, Danes, Brits held in prison in Russia, at least as far as I know. There may be some hapless spy who's been caught, but I checked, as far as I can see, there was a Norwegian guy who was arrested, but I think he's been freed now. But basically, you could not say that Russia is holding political prisoners from Northern Europe. China, different story. Swedish citizen Gui Minhai, arrested, or abducted rather, kidnapped, show trial, breaching all judicial norms, and badly treated in China. And he's not the only one. Very recently, we had the case of Peter Humphrey, British citizen, arrested, maltreated, given a false confession, a British embassy worker in Hong Kong, arrested, maltreated, formal protest. China doesn't take any notice. We have and of course, moving a little bit further across the Atlantic to Northern America rather than North Europe, we have the two Michaels, both basically hostages. We also see this diplomatic pressure, very much devoted towards Sweden. We used to make fun of the kind of bombastic nonsense that we would hear from Russian ambassadors in Stockholm. Well, the Olympic gold, silver and bronze medals for that now all go to the Chinese. It's a extraordinary Chinese diplomatic pressure, meeting very strong resistance, one should say, across Swedish society. But the really remarkable thing, and this is perhaps where I will finish on, is the lack of solidarity. I have not seen the Finns, the Norwegians, the Danes, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians leaping to the defense of the Swedes. To be fair, the Lithuanians have taken a very strong line on China. As some of you know, I'm involved in the International Parliamentary Coalition on China, IPAC, and we're getting bipartisan co-chairs from all sorts of countries. We have now more than 100 parliamentarians from 20 countries, including Swedes and Lithuanians, I'm glad to say. And the Lithuanians have been very good on this. But one cannot say that when China has a go with either diplomatic or other means at Northern Europe, you see North European solidarity. And I think that is going to be the story going forward. We're going to need, for the countries of Northern Europe, to be a strong coalition on Chinese economic pressure, cyber pressure, diplomatic pressure, this humanitarian stuff of taking hostages. I would love to see, for example, the Baltic states opening a joint office in Taipei, Taiwan. I would love to see the Norwegians and Swedes and Finns and others following the lead of the Netherlands and upping their existing presence in Taipei. The Dutch had a thing called the Economic and Cultural Office Taipei, with a picture of a tulip as its logo. And they've just changed it to Netherlands Office Taipei with a picture of the Dutch flag. And these are small things, but the Chinese really mind about them. They don't cost us very much, but the more that we do it, the harder it is for the Chinese then to pick off and retaliate against countries that do it. So I think that the Northern Europe is a kind of security crucible, not in that it's going to be attacked. It's not the cockpit of Europe at the moment, I don't think. I think that places like the Black Sea and the Western Balkans are a lot more vulnerable when it comes to disorder. But I think in Northern Europe, crossing all these boundaries between rich and poor, old Europe, New Europe, NATO and the EU, big and small, nuclear, non-nuclear, all these different things, I think we can see the beginnings of a sort of a durable, resilient security coalition, which is exactly what we need when we want to stand up to Chinese pressure, which I think is going to be 90% of the problem in the years ahead. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion and to the questions.
Thank you, Edward, for that. In sum, then, not so much change regarding Russia, perhaps more regarding China, actually. I think we will come back to that. I just want to double check that with our Russian expert. So let me turn to Kadri Leek, who is Senior Policy Fellow at the ECFR Berlin, with an extensive knowledge of Russia and the Baltic Sea, former director of ICDS in Estonia. Kadri, has the corona crisis and the low crude oil prices affected Russia's posture and ambitions in Northern Europe, in your view? Do you see this? It might be even an opening for a possibility for more dialogue or cooperation with Russia? Kadri, the floor.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Greetings from Estonia, from Muhu Island. It's beautiful here. And yes, I do agree with Edward that there are reasons to feel uneasy about China over the coming years, whereas things to worry about Russia, we more or less know already. In that sense, I'm quite happy that it seems to me that people in this region have woken up to the danger that could come from China, especially as concerns using economic might for political pressure. I think when it comes to that, Russia and China cannot be compared. China would be much more ruthless. And here in the Baltic states, at least for a long time, we have been so absorbed by Russia that we have had blind spot about China. We have paid very little attention. Only now with US-China standoff, I think there has been a certain wider awakening, and people have started asking questions about China. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a little bit doing right thing for wrong reasons. We should worry about China because China behaves the way it does, not because Trump chooses to pick a fight with China. But anyway, I'm happy that we are looking at it. As concerns Russia, then when I talk about Russia here in Estonia, I say that Russia is a buffer state between Estonia and China, and we need to value it as such. And I'm not entirely joking. I much rather live next to Russia than China, I must confess. And when it comes to Russia and COVID, I do not think much will change inevitably. Russia is very self-absorbed right now. They have voted on constitutional changes on 1st of July. The exact implications of changes, what exactly is being planned in the Kremlin, we don't know. I mean, changes open up lots of opportunities, but we don't know which of them will be used. The Kremlin is probably nervous because domestic handover of power is always tricky in countries such as this. After 20 years of Putin, any alternative arrangement is complicated, and Putin staying on is also complicated. And Russia's opportunities to act are, of course, a little bit constrained for economic reasons. Drop in oil price, economic slump because of COVID, they will all be there. Russia has, of course, also gathered huge reserves, so I wouldn't over-dramatize it. They can last for a long time, and they have actually constrained their budget expenditure. So their break-even point is much lower in terms of price of oil than it used to be. So expecting Russia to go bankrupt soon is misplaced. They will manage for a long while, but they will be quite cautious and focusing on domestic issues, reacting probably to outside world rather than initiating big things themselves, except of course the things where they are already part of process, such as Middle East, Syria. Russia will not leave its role there because of economic constraints or anything. Neither, I think, can we expect it to retreat from Donbass, at least definitely not because of economic pressures, and political conditions for leaving Donbass do not seem to be there. But also, I think it is misplaced to expect Russia to be more open to some sort of cooperation with Europe that has been recently offered by President Macron. I spent quite some time this spring, right before the pandemic hit, talking to people in Moscow about that. And I didn't see anyone who would have believed that Macron's opening can lead to anything meaningful. And this is actually quite curious, because Russia has always wanted to discuss European security order. That has been almost a mantra for them. They have thought that this is the problem with Europe, that we don't have an order that is working. And you remember Medvedev's initiatives from 2009, and it lasted much longer. Very recently, Russian officials would suggest talking about European security order. But now when Macron is suggesting exactly that, they are not engaging. So to me, that was really curious, and I tried to understand why. And it seems there really are multiple reasons behind it. One is Macron himself. I think Russians have long ago decided that he is one of those politicians who compensates for domestic weaknesses by launching bold but thinly thought through foreign policy initiatives. And he doesn't offer much detail, and that leaves Russians to shrug, saying that it's all declarations, nothing of substance. They do not think Macron will be able to deliver Europe, so to say. They see that Germany is not on board, and they believe it will not be, and that makes it a no-go in relations with Europe. But also, breakthrough in relations with Europe is not something they think can be achieved, because Europe is not a big player in the world as far as they are concerned. Many people have doubts about European Union's viability in general. Not those who know Europe well, but there aren't that many people in Russian political establishment who know what European Union is about, how it functions, and how resilient it is. And of course, Europe's reaction to corona crisis, everyone closing borders and all countries acting on their own, that actually feeds the biases of people who think that European Union as such is not a coherent international actor. And that leads to them questioning, why should engage with Europe at all? It's like two moving targets talking. Russia is changing, Europe is changing. You cannot fix a relationship. Furthermore, Macron's idea to get closer to Russia, to tear Russia off China, so to say, is not flying at all. Russia has become a little bit more reserved about China. There is some debate about the limits of cooperation with China, but it is very far from the debate we are having in the West. And having good relations with China is strategic in a way, because Russia feels that they cannot afford bad relations. So even if behind the scenes, at one point, they might start hedging against China, they want to preserve a cordial facade, and they are not coming along with our proposals to join us against China. This is not happening, definitely. And furthermore, interestingly, I think something has changed in Russia's diplomatic culture itself, probably because of Syria, because Russia has been very legalistic and very focused on normative initiatives. And now suddenly they are not anymore, at least not to that extent. And it seems to have something to do with their experience in Syria. They have been acting forcefully. They have been getting results. As far as they are concerned, Syria is a success story for them. And I think that has given them some sort of self-confidence that if needed, they can act improvisingly and forcefully and suddenly. And that makes them a little bit less obsessed with normative frameworks in the world, which they don't think are achievable anyway, because the world for them is in such a big chaos that to talk about any kind of order is not feasible. So in terms of diplomatic initiatives, what I see happening, I think Russia is investing in P5 meeting, permanent members of UN Security Council. That has been Russia's initiative for a while already. First, they wanted it to get together in Moscow, 9th of May. That quickly became unfeasible. Now there is some talk about autumn and UN General Assembly, but we don't know about that either. But I think the idea behind it is sort of twofold. One is PR, just to position Russia as a peacemaker. The idea to connect it with 9th of May was, to perpetuate the certain type of reading of the Second World War, which has been endangered by recent declarations by European Parliament and so forth. So it was sort of giving the right tone about events of the past and Russia's position in international system. But in terms of practical agenda, people are not sure whether anything, whether they can manage to prepare any agenda of substance. But what I see, there is desire to talk about arms control. Russia really would like to preserve START. It has views on open skies, INF, and even though Trump administration is unlikely to engage with those in a way Russia would like, and about next administration, we don't know. But I think to achieve some sort of preliminary agreement to start at one point somehow talking about these things is what Russia would want to achieve. So it's fairly low-key agenda. And I think the odds are that it will stay that way. It's not a given that we should expect any big moves from Russia, especially in the Baltic region. I don't see that. But then again, of course, Russia is good at reacting and can do that forcefully. So if something changes, and not necessarily in our region, it can be in some other theater, then we could see totally different developments, and all what I have just said now will be invalid.
Thank you so much, Kadri, for that excellent analysis. Very interesting, I think, for all of us. And I think we can come back to that issue also of a European security order and any prospects for that to occur. I would like, it's also a good bridge to our next speaker, the doubts that the Russians have on EU as an actor, a moving target, you call it. So I would like to turn to Dr. Julia Declerck-Sachse, with an extensive career at the European External Action Service, but just shifted to Oxford University, where she leads a project on Europe's narrative in times of geopolitical competition, and also a senior fellow with the GMF. So we see the EU now struggling with the asymmetric shock of the coronavirus. There are internal tensions between its members, as well as the risks for foreign investments in critical assets. In all of this, how can a geopolitical EU develop through this corona crisis? Julia, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to the Atlantic Council and also the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Gabriele for the introduction. It's great to be here for this timely debate. And yeah, let me take it a little bit to the sort of more strategic level on talking about the challenge of great power competition. How does the EU and can it react to that? And what does the current corona crisis sort of show us about that, and what should be, and I think what's also important, not just should be, but also could and can be the EU response to that. And I think the first thing is, of course, that this sort of challenge that's for the European Union is how does it adapt to great power competition? As we've heard, that the story's really moved into that direction for a long time. It was really Russia, the external sort of challenger, And now it's all about US-China tensions. Now, I think for the EU, there's even sort of within its nature already a challenge in that, of course, the whole story, the narrative, if you will, is all now about competition and power, whereas the EU was built for cooperation and institutions, for diffusing power, right? So that's already a sort of paradigm shift and paradigm shock, if you will, for Europeans and for the institutions as well. So that's the sort of first thing that Europeans needed to adapt to. I think the second thing is, of course, that things aren't so black and white anymore. So as we've already heard, Europeans have woken up to the fact that China is a real challenge. There's been a communication on this, a sort of strategic paper that calls it that as well, the strategic challenge. There's a lot of talking and some action in that direction. So it's clear that this is not just a sort of economic competitor that needs to be managed. There are much bigger security challenges coming from China. But at the same time, there is a continued need to also work with China on some major issues that matter to the European Union, such as climate change. And also China, of course, has sort of opted into the system that the EU has been promoted, which is sort of cooperation through institutions, but not by, as we hoped and expected, by being more cooperative and going sort of adopting more of the norms and values of that cooperative order by actually co-opting those institutions and changing the nature of the game, if you will, changing the nature of how you can work through those institutions and actually projecting and exerting quite effectively through the very sort of institutional system that was built to keep those threats at bay, actually exercising influence. At the same time, as we've already heard from some of the speakers, the US is a sort of much more uncertain player, and while it's still considered to be sort of Europe's essential partner in managing this, it's actually opted out of those very institutions that Europeans, again, prefer to work through and do that, and also questioned that. So that makes it much more tricky for Europeans to kind of find their place in this world order. I think the second thing that was highlighted briefly by both Edward and Kadri as well is, of course, the challenge of solidarity. So how do you project yourself globally when you have that challenge internally of solidarity? And again, that's being challenged on one hand because you have a sort of competitive order at the same time of being interdependent. And so both China and the US in a way have weaponized that interdependence and have in some degrees tried to play divide and conquer among Europeans and sort of exacerbated, whether willingly or just by sticking to the positions that they hold on security and so on, actually exacerbated tensions or at least certain divisions between Europeans. And the other one is that the sort of the nature of the threats that the European Union has been facing, and I think COVID, and that's my segue to the second point, is one good example of that, are so existential in a way and go so much to the core of what a society is and what sort of Europeans feel, that the reaction hasn't been one sort of cooperating, but actually closing borders, as Kadri has said, or keeping your medical equipment to yourself rather than sharing it. So the European Union is confronted through the COVID crisis with a tension that it actually knows quite well, which is that balance between sort of the need to cooperate. It's very clear, the analysis is there, is bigger than ever, because Europeans know that alone they can't face these challenges and they need each other. As Edward has said, regional groupings, certainly the EU as such, to project anything at all in this sort of much more dangerous world now. But at the same time, the threats are of a nature that sort of goes so much to the existence that the natural instinct is to turn inwards. And we've seen this with COVID now, but I think we've seen that with the migration crisis, we've seen that with the Euro crisis. So there's this current tension between the two that need to be managed. And I think when the trust then becomes really important and is difficult to sustain. Now, what how is the EU responding and how should it be responding? I think we see a little bit of both, as the EU loves to do, which is on one hand, to sort of continue and invest in cooperation both amongst Europeans but also internationally, but also building up autonomy. And I think in the security field, we've seen that by sort of stepping up cooperation with NATO, but also, of course, then investing in strategic autonomy and investing in sort of EU-owned capabilities. With the crisis now, we've seen that finding, international partners working internationally, but also finding, EU responses, making sure that certain things like pharmaceuticals are produced again locally, where we've been incredibly dependent on China as well if it comes to certain pharmaceuticals and so on. I think we've seen, for example, Germany and France proposing in the economic sphere, greater cooperation, redistribution, and so on. But of course, we also see, and also if you look at the North, a hesitancy towards that. We're seeing it with disinformation, one of the threats that you mentioned that I think is really important, and we're also, again, now, which we traditionally associate with Russia, but where really China is a really important and big player, and that's come out, again, has been really highlighted through the COVID crisis, but which was there already before, a sort of need to pull together and find common solutions as Europeans, and also through the G7 and so on internationally. So I think that the EU is at a sort of critical point, because on one hand, I think its approach is being validated in a way, one, that you do need cooperation, and also that security threats are so broad these days that it's got a good setup in terms of the competences that it has, for example, economically, and the institutions. But at the same time, the degree of the crisis is so deep that the instinct sort of not to cooperate and each to themselves is there. And as Kadri has said, that actually also highlight or undermines the ability to project internationally, because of course it makes itself susceptible to then appearing weak or disunited. And so it will be really a test, I think, to see whether now member states will kind of take this challenge and use it to really project outwards, or whether it will sort of see that it's being tested to such a degree that it can't really actually fathom a united response.
Thank you so much for that insightful analysis, Julia. I up to China, and that has really become obvious for us. I want to move on to and turn to Dr. Andre Michta, who's Dean at the College of International Security Studies at the George Marshall Center in Germany, a well-known expert on European and transatlantic relations, who held positions as professor at US Naval War College, Rhodes College, and much more. But lately you have focused a lot on China, the US, and the growing tensions between them. And how do you see China affecting Northern Europe and on the transatlantic also? Can the EU and the US agree on a common response on China? That has become sort of a key question that also affects this region to quite a big extent. Andrew, please.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Atlantic Council, for having me. I also apologize for my voice. It's allergy season, so I'm struggling. Let me also preface my comments by saying that I'm speaking in my private capacity again as an analyst, and what I have to say here does not reflect the policy or position of the Marshall Center, the Defense Department, or the US government. And let me address your question in the following way. I think the greatest challenge that we will have going forward as Europeans and Americans is agreeing on China, agreeing on what China represents and how China ought to be seen. We may differ on how we respond to Russia, and NATO has been clearly and kind of a stage on which this different view of Russia has been to some extent playing itself out. NATO has taken a clear position on Russia, but if you travel through Europe and if you move across European capitals from east to west, you see what I call a regionalized security optics assert itself. You see, if you are in Norway or in the Baltic states or in Poland, it's all about Russia. Russia is the principal concern. As you're moving farther to Central Europe and then to Western Europe, that optic will change. And if you're in Paris, you realize that the South, the Med, Africa and all of that seems to be dominating the conversation. And if you get even farther west to Spain or Portugal, the conversation itself may be difficult. China is a different animal in all of this. I would argue that the biggest problem we have from the US perspective is that we are seriously waking up, maybe a couple of years too late, to the dilemma of what China has become over the last 3 decades, actually 4 decades plus, but really the last 3 decades of unbridled globalization, the kind of massive transfer of manufacturing, of research, technology, know-how from the United States and increasingly also from Western Europe to China has been based on misreading where the Chinese state was going to be within the next 20, 30 years. A lot of that was, I believe, both driven by near-term profit considerations and also by quite frankly, fundamentally misreading what happened at the end of the Cold War. The belief that export-driven modernization would make China into a responsible stakeholder in the international system, I think has been exposed in this crisis more than during any other instance for what it actually is. And what we have discovered in the process is that today, if you look at the great power competition paradigm, if you look at our national security strategy from 2017, our new national defense strategy from 2018, we are looking at great power competition with 2, not just 1, near-peer adversaries. One that is a revisionist power, which is the Russian Federation. It wants to revise the post-Cold War order in Europe and has already taken some very significant steps in that direction. Here, I agree with what Edward was saying. I think Russia is much more predictable in terms of how it operates. The other great power is China, and China does not simply want to revise the international order. It wants to replace the international order with a set of assumptions, a set of supply chain flows, and the overall grand strategic relationship between maritime and land domains. And it's been well underway to move in that direction. It has emerged from decades of accumulating massive trade surpluses. This process was accelerated even more when China joined the World Trade Organization, arguably one of the most ill-conceived decisions, in my view, on our part. And China is now in the process of very rapid expansion of its hard power capabilities. It includes expansion of the People's Liberation Army Navy. It includes the development of the PLA. It includes opening up new potentially Nordic trade routes and military area with the tenders for the new nuclear powered icebreakers that the Chinese are putting out there. So when you look at the Belt and Road project, which is to integrate Eurasia and by extension look at Europe, in my view, as a terminal point of the Chinese supply chains and not an entry point for the transatlantic community. And all of this is happening at a time when the United States military, having been engaged in nonstop combat operations and restructured to operate in those theaters, is in the process of very rapid, but probably a delayed rebuilding. So we're looking at the US military and the US strategy that probably allows us now confidently to engage in one potential major conflict and one smaller operation, not like in the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War, where you had the forces structured to fight in 2 theaters. And at the same time, in contrast to what you had in the Cold War, you have now China that is no longer just a regional player, but increasingly a geostrategically assertive player, both in Europe. The Chinese Navy operates in the Mediterranean, the Chinese acquisition of ports testifies to the intent. Chinese Navy has been able to get into the Baltic and is moving aggressively into the Arctic. I bring this up because I think it's essential for the discussion about security in Europe, and especially in the North, as it is our focus today. I've been arguing for quite some time that there is no substitute for the European decision at individual state level or within the context of the alliance to rebuild the military capabilities of the armed forces. And I will not go through a litany that you probably know better than I, but over the last 20 years, we have witnessed a de facto demilitarization of large segments of the NATO alliance. We've tried since 2014 to reverse the process. I frankly am not that concerned about 2%, 3%, 1%. These are not real targets for me. The reality for me is that in the event there is a crisis in the Indo-Pacific, it's likely to pull a lot of US assets into that theater. And if Europe is not sufficiently resourced to deter opportunistic behavior from Russia, we all will end up in a situation that's going to cost us dearly. What I'm essentially driving at, and that's kind of the most general point that I want to make, and I'm happy to answer questions, the rebuilding of Europe's military capabilities within NATO, and I emphasize this, within NATO, I think talking about strategic autonomy and various other schemes is ill-advised. But rebuilding the European military within NATO so that it can credibly deter and, if need be, defend with the US nuclear guarantee, with the US enablers. As you know, the US Army Europe has increased its footprint over the last several years. But nonetheless, resting on that capability is absolutely essential for the security, not just of the North, but of the entire continent. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me still? Because I have some problems with the sound. Good. Thank you so much for all of these. And just very quick, as I listen to all of you, it seems as if it's a bit business as usual with regard to Russia. Perhaps not that much of movement, but during the Corona crisis, yet the effects. More turmoil perhaps around both the US and a real wake-up call around China, as we hear it. But Andrew, can I just make a follow-up question there on the transatlantic relation, how you view it, and the US commitment to Northern Europe and the security here? During the Corona crisis, the US has also left the Open Skies Treaty, and we have had this announcement of troop reduction in Germany. So that has, because if you look at how to deal with China, you have to know where you have the US, how much can we go forward. So how do you view this puzzle of how the players interact and engage in Europe and Northern Europe in particular?
On the what you're referring to, Anna, on the troop withdrawal, I caution everyone not to jump the gun on this and base official statements on pronouncements printed in the Wall Street Journal, a very respectable newspaper. I enjoy reading it, and I'm not disavowing it, but I'm simply saying I think any sort of statements before there is an official announcement of any decision, I think are premature. I don't think they're helping our allies. I don't think they're helping the transatlantic conversation. So I'm encouraging our German friends, and I'm encouraging our East European friends, Central European friends, our Baltic friends to go langsam and wait as the situation develops. And if you consider where we were when the announcement was made and where we are today, these are two different things. The larger question that I want to raise, and maybe I'm expressing a certain degree of frustration. I would caution people from associating the friction in transatlantic relations with this or that administration. The point I was trying to make is that the rebuilding of European defenses is, in my view, an imperative regardless of whether we have the Trump administration or the Biden administration or any other administration in Washington. The Russians have gone through 2 cycles of disarmament. If you look at the kind of purchasing power parity equivalents of what they've expended, it seems to be moderate compared to the size of the US defense budget. Having said that, if you put this in the context of regional imbalances and what has happened to the European militaries in the process, the relative balance of power has shifted dramatically against especially the NATO flanked countries. And what the Russians have been doing in terms of their exercising since essentially the late 1990s needs to be countered with readiness, exercised capabilities. And I don't mean, capabilities on paper. Capabilities that are not exercised are really vaporware. It's only by exercising them, by training jointly with American allies, with European allies, can you have a credible deterrent. This virus crisis has in effect stopped the Europe Defender 20, the largest exercise, the kind of smaller scale reforger that we were in the midst of exercising. And yet, even if you look at that scale, we're looking at about 20,000 US troops, about 18,000 European troops. It was an important exercise, but nonetheless, the scale of what's needed, I would argue, is greater. So my concern is that we are now 6 years since the seizure of Crimea, and we're still continuing to seemingly debate the 2%, the 1.8%, when will we reach the certain percentage? I honestly don't think that's the right trajectory to move on. And if we stay in this burden sharing debate, rather than quite honestly burden transferring within NATO, the term I would use, that is understanding that a substantial element of European deterrent forces and defense capabilities has to rest on European military forces. I emphasize, with the US providing the high end, providing the enablers, and providing a significant operational force as we're doing currently. Last point I want to make, I understand this crisis has hit everybody very hard. The kind of flooding of the system with liquidity, which the Europeans are doing and we're doing, is going to wreak havoc. We don't really know what we will look like at the end of this process. We know what we know what a recession looks like. We know what a depression even looks like. We don't know what a suppression of economic activity looks like if it lasts for a longer period of time. Still, I would argue that rebuilding the militaries ought to be near the top priorities for every government in Europe if we are to maintain the transatlantic alliance robust and strong, which we both need. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, for outlining that posture that we need to really have, and I think look into in I would like to have a question from the audience, which has to do with, I think there is pretty broad actually consensus regarding the main traits of the US stance on China, that it has become tougher. But in Europe, from Edward Lucas, that not even the Nordic have a common stance, which we usually can formulate. Here that Europe thinks that it does not want to become a victim between the US and the EU. So we have a question here from Erik Tiselius to all of you, really. Germany will take over, it goes like this. Germany will take over the EU common China strategy for the right on this issue. Did you hear me? Det är ingen som hör mig. You don't hear me? You hear me, Andrew?
So I can hear you now, but I couldn't hear you then.
Okay, anyone who hears me wants to answer.
Yeah, but I couldn't hear the question.
Do you hear me?
You could just repeat the question, because I also had trouble hearing the actual question. The German presidency we got, I think, but the common EU strategy towards China, if you could just briefly recap.
Du måste sätta på ljud.
I still
I'm
can't
sorry,
hear
this
anything.
is working badly.
I'm sorry.
Anyone on... Todd, do you have a view on this?
Anna, if you don't mind, can you hear me, guys? Thumbs up if you do. The question is, Germany will take over the EU presidency next month. One of the main goals is to form a common China strategy for the Union. Can the EU unite on this issue? That was the question. Thank you.
Do you want me to go in, Anna?
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a serious problem here, which is that you've got some kind of state capture in Hungary and Greece. At least we have had that. And we've seen previous attempts by the EU even to come up with a composition on human rights in China have been blocked by those countries. And so it's going to be difficult. I think that the idea that we've already nailed down the idea of the EU that China is a rival. And that implies, we're out of this sort of Kantian win-win world, which at least had been very big in some people's minds. But I think for the Germans, it's going to be really difficult because we've complained in the past about the role that German business has in steering that country towards a sort of Kremlin-friendly policy. But I've always thought that was a little bit overstated because actually Germany trades more with Poland than it does with Russia. With Visegrad 4, it trades twice as much, even with energy included, than it does with Russia. So the kind of Russian influence was a bit overstated. The Chinese influence is huge in Germany. Yeah, this is a really big deal for Germany, both as a manufacturing place, part of the supply chain, and as a market. So I'm not particularly optimistic about this. I think it's going to be, and it's also very difficult in Germany because it's seen as a sort of Trump project. That this is, if you want to stand up to China, then you're going along with Trump, and Trump obviously is the most unpopular president in Europe. So I think that on the surface it may be quite difficult, but on the other hand, these things aren't done in 6 months, and what we're seeing is a gradual turn, and I suspect that turn will continue. But I think that within the EU we're going to see smaller subgroups of countries taking a tough line, and as I said earlier, I think that Northern Europe could well be one of them. We may even see a kind of north-south divide with the South European countries, in Italy as well, being pretty dovish on China and the North European ones being pretty hawkish. Did anyone hear a word of that?
I have. Edward, yes, I have.
Edward.
Yes.
The broadcasting from my point of view, we have reached the time limit to discussion, and just a few things I think are worth mentioning then that I take with me. We heard regarding Russia that they're perhaps not that interested in security order discussions if there are not substance in them, but for instance arms control could be one such area which could be interesting for Russia. China, we have a suggestion from Edward on the Resilient Security Coalition, and much more of a strategy towards China. In that, on greater military responsibility within the NATO framework. Clarity of paradigm shift to also understand that it has not only to deal with cooperation in the world, but the competition and the implications for that, stepping up on various issues such as disinformation and also China strategy. So thank you all for joining us. Apologies once again for the internet this time, but you will be able to see this and listen to the experts online on various channels. So please join us again and follow us. So see you later. Bye-bye. Thank you.